Okay, team. Well, let's get into it. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Dave Hughes, and welcome to the North Sales Pre-Bacardi Winter Series webinar. The idea behind this webinar is to revisit some of the lessons with the J70 and the Melges 24 and Biscayne Bay as we get ready for the regatta this coming weekend here in Miami. Today, I'm joined by Allan Terhune, Nick Tierney, Mike Marshall, Stu McNay, and obviously all of you. On deck, we're discussing the two fleets, but specifically some questions that we have had from the audience that have already been sent in, and we encourage you to type in your questions as we continue. We'll keep the discussion to about 30 minutes, and Mike Marshall will be the moderator for the discussion. And so I say with that, let's crack into it. And Mike, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Looking forward to it, as many of you have seen before. We've done a lot of these over the years, but this is kind of an interesting one because it's a little bit sort of before the event, and we've got a great group here with obviously Nick, Allan, Stu, and Dave, and and it's just this is a pretty interesting one because you get to kind of see, or at least the way I was kind of thinking about this with the group was sort of saying, okay, well, what are you guys thinking about? What's everyone thinking about going into the weekend? And, sort of, I know what I'm thinking about. And we look at the forecast and we say it's going to be between, somewhere around 8 to 10 knots for the weekend is what it kind of looks like. Obviously, the forecast is ever changing. We can't rely on it, but it's somewhere in that vicinity. And so we're starting to think about how we're, potentially going to be setting the boats up, what we might be focusing on in our practice, what we're trying to get the most out of the weekend. So, just kind of want to start out and maybe we just start out. Nick, you happen to be first on my screen and you were in the J70s a lot in the last time. And so, what are you thinking about going into the weekend in terms of goals for training, boat setup, that kind of stuff? And we can get into the nuances of tuning and that kind of stuff as we go here. But just sort of global thoughts that you're thinking about going into the weekend.
Thanks, Mike. So at the last event and this event, I had the pleasure of sitting in a coach boat all week. And it's a different perspective for sure when you're in the coach boat, looking out at the race course and looking at your teams. Uh, my goal when I'm working with these teams before the event is working through our process. So what that means is a lot of looking at the weather forecast for sure. But once we're on the water, going through our processes, so boat handling, starting drills, starting practice, things like that, and just nailing out all those details. I think it's really important for any event, really, to set these processes up. And by that, I mean sitting down with your team and going through a startup sequence. Who's communicating about what? Who's looking at what? Who's trimming sails? The process of getting the boat to accelerate, the process of understanding your time and distance, your ratio to the line. Even sit down with your team and go through a set or a douse, that process, who's doing what in what sequence. With my teams, we rehearse all the stuff on land before we go sailing with some of the new teams I work with, some of the more seasoned veteran teams. We have processes that we've already established, and it's about executing those once we get on the water. But we develop a routine that works for us, and we replicate that routine day in and day out. Same processes, same goals every day, and work through that routine. It seems to produce some of these decent results, and at least now that we have a process, we have something that we can work from and start from. So, my best advice as you guys prepare for this event is sit down as a team and talk about what your processes might look like and how to approach that and what each day is going to look like for you guys as a new team.
And so adding to that, and Stu, you're also in the J70 group as well. Obviously that's sort of the overview of how you get into it. In terms of the nuances, for any of the teams out here, you're looking at that forecast, Biscayne Bay, like the back of your hand. And, what are you thinking about in terms of your boat setup now, and, kind of drilling down into the details of what you would be thinking about in terms of your rig, your steps on the rig, given those conditions as you go?
Well, I think that the most important thing, as far as rig tuning goes in the J70, is to get your pre-bend correct. And get your pre-bend correct at the base tune. We worked with Nick Turney a bit on this actually last year. And then that will let you have the right steps down and the right steps up. In fact, if it's going to be a windy event, it's even a worthwhile exercise to, on the dock, bring your boat up steps and to see that your pre-bend more or less remains the same. That's a great indicator that your ratio of uppers to lowers on your tuning grid is good. And now looking ahead to this event, it looks like we'll be in base tune or perhaps steps down for lighter air. And so you would also want to then check your pre-bend as you go to your lighter air setups to make sure that your mast actually isn't getting straighter, because that really works against you when you're trying to have a firm main sheet in the underpowered conditions.
Uh, What's the pre-bend that you're targeting?
Um, it depends on your mast. And there are a couple models of sail out there. 50 to 55 is a great range. But I might defer to Nick on this one because he really knows the full inventory.
Yeah, I think to give an average, 2 inches is a good target to start off with in the J70. Then you can different mainsail that you're using, different left curve, different mass, Selden rig versus Southern rig. But if you get to that 2 inch base mark, you're going to be pretty close with whatever setup you're running.
Okay. So you guys are really in the 70, you're kind of starting into that base rig tune setup that you're kind of getting to, which is that 2 inches. You're starting to think about how you're going to keep the boat, through the range of settings that you're planning to use for the event. In this case, it's likely base, maybe a step down, maybe one step up max. That's kind of what the forecast looks, obviously ever changing. And so it's really important, that boat prep part that we're kind of talking about to make sure the boat's ready. So obviously been sailing a lot in the 24 and the Melges 24, and as has Allan, current North American champion. Allan, what are your thoughts from the Melges 24 perspective on, boat prep, that kind of stuff, looking at the event, looking at the forecast, similar kind of questions. And then I'm gonna
Yeah.
pose the same question to Dave, who was also sailing the last event.
Yeah, I mean, the last event, it was the first time I'd sailed a 24 in 15 or 18 years or something like that. So it was good to get back in it and see it. And I think, look at the forecast this weekend. It kind of reminds me of the last regatta a little bit in that, you got to set the boat up for power. And I think the one mistake that I learned right away in the 24 is, you have to do everything you can to get your full team hiking as hard as they can right away and then never stop hiking. So I think it's pretty easy in the light stuff to get tricked into not hiking as hard or not getting as powered up because you think it's light, but it's actually a mistake. I think you do everything you can to keep the boat. You want to be hiking right away. And I know crews don't necessarily want to hear that, but you can see the teams that were hiking even, in 6 knots of breeze and hiking as hard as they could, it made a huge difference. So I think, going to the weekend, that's got to be the goal is getting ready to, really just hike back even in that 8 to 10 knots of breeze because it makes all the difference in the world, I think, which, it's maybe not the most fun, but there's a lot of reward for working hard at it for sure.
Getting the boat powered up. Yeah. And
Yeah.
part of that, I mean, as well, we can't state it enough, but having tight lifelines, that's
Yep.
another one that keeps the team out of the water when they are hiking in that condition because the boat's so flat. I was finding that,
Yep.
and I'm sure we'll get something else on this from Dave as well. But it's definitely the piece that I was, being able to hike in that condition, getting the first people to get over their crew over the rail is likely one of the fastest boats on the race course. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think, having the heel angle constant and, pretty low in a number, believe it or not, is pretty quick. I mean, we were, definitely low single digits in terms of heel, 5, 6, 7 degrees, something like that, and just hiking the whole time. That's when we were the best, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dave, with those thoughts in mind, in terms of rig, what are you kind of thinking about in the boat? And again, or if there's something else that you'd be prepping for with a weekend that looks very similar to what a little bit of what we saw last time.
Yeah, I mean, Alan said it really well, and as did you. It is all about hiking, and Alan's last comment about keeping the boat fairly flat is true. The Melges will side slip very quickly. In terms of tuning, I've typically always reminded myself in light air events to be on the ease side of my tuning grid, just to generate that hiking power. Because the earlier you do generate the hiking power, the better. And then maybe once you're hiking, you might mentally want to flip a switch and change that tune, but it's just okay. You're going to be fine, particularly when the wind weight in Biscayne Bay can be pretty light as opposed to other venues. And so being on the light side of your tuning grid is critical. And in hiking, the items that I think are quite critical with teams is to have just the different steps of hiking. For example, having the two forward hands pressing hard into the tight lifelines, like you mentioned, and then the maybe whoever's on the jib is sitting with them and up forward, and then they can slide behind and start hiking as well. So there needs to be just different steps. It's not, don't think about it in terms of binary, we're hiking, or all of us are not hiking. You can employ, one or two people hiking, and then have to quickly go into all crew hiking. Now, granted, it's different for different boats because some people have legs in for the position number two, and some people are a bit of a mix, but still the same theme.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that the parallels between the two boats, as we kind of go into that and we'll dive into this sort of getting the boat powered up, a little bit more and kind of bring it back to the 70 here as well, in that, and we found that the most powerful way in the 24 front two people are hiking, they're just hiking as hard as they can in that mode, as you were saying. And then, you end up with a person behind, they're either hiking or trimming the jib and making sure the boat's going fast. And I think the same thing would hold for the J70, even though there's one fewer people. You end up with potentially the first one out hiking really, obviously you can't Melges 24 style hike on the J70, but they're hiking hard, and then the next person's working the jib to keep the boat going, and then as you step through that range. And so, back to you, Nick, on this in terms of the 70, is that kind of what you're seeing? Is that what you're expecting? Is that what you've had? And especially thinking about the fact that Saturday and Sunday is probably going to be a warm day in Miami, so there's going to be a lot of power boaters out there, so you're going to get a lot more chop with that 8 to 10 knot wind range. And especially with us having the course that we are, which is potentially a little bit further in because we're one of the few fleets out there on a combined fleet, so we're likely a little closer to the channel. So talk us through that in the 70 a little bit.
Yeah, so I always want to have the sensation if I'm crewing or trimming on the J70 and I'm sitting on the rail, even legs in, sitting on the rail, you want to have the sensation that the boat is lifting up underneath your butt. You want to have that sensation that the boat wants to heel. If the boat feels like it's flat and mushy, then you need to add more power. You got to power up the rig, you got to power up the sail plan, you got to sail a more powerful angle. Do everything you can to create that sensation that the boat is pushing up underneath your butt. And that goes not just for light air, but heavy air too. Like the J70 likes having that sensation, that load of heel angle up underneath the crew hiking. Uh, the J70 is a boat that it's a little more, in my opinion, a little more sensitive to heel angle than the Melges, where the Melges 24, you want to sail the boat pretty flat all the time. The J70 seems to like a little bit of heel angle going upwind and same downwind. Never sailing the boat dead flat seems to be kind of a key. So talk about upwind target heel angle, 8 to 10 degrees of heel angle upwind in the light stuff is usually a pretty good target. as you start to get a little bit more powered up, no more than 12 degrees of heel angle. And the J70 is kind of a good target to shoot for. Um, and then, Mike, your point about sailing and chop and current, I think it's really important to pay attention to the overall power in your boat. And when you're going through chop and current, always having the ability to put more power in. Like you never want to get caught with the rig tight and in a situation where I can't ease sails anymore. I can't add more power to the boat. My back stays all the way off. That's a indicator that you're gonna be in a pretty slow setup going through that transition, that chop. So we always talk about how much more power do we have to give into the boat, or are we out of power? Are we underpowered? Do we need more? Are we overpowered? Do we need less? We always have that conversation on the boats I sail on and work with. And where are we at with our backstay? Are we all the way on? Are we all the way off? If the bat in the J70, if your backstay is all the way off, it's a pretty good indicator that you need to loosen the rig up a little bit more and add more power into your sail plan to setup. So I don't know, Stu, you've been sailing these boats quite a bit with Paul Green and those guys. And, do you agree with my comments there on like rig tune and heel angle and keeping the boat juicy up underneath the crew?
Yeah, I do. And then also kind of blending that with what the Melges guys are saying, just how good it is to be hiking if you can, and really, really, really pushing the limit on that. So if the water is flat in light air upwind and the boat's going well, you can be 4, 5, or 6 degrees of heel, and the boat can keep carrying nicely. As it gets choppier, you're going to need a little more heel. And then, yeah, that's where you get the 8, 9, 10 degrees of heel and maybe 6 or 7 knots of wind. But I think what's really important is that the crew is ready to hike anytime more pressure is introduced to the boat. So let's say you're in the configuration like you were talking about, Nick, where and Mike was talking about, where the jib trimmer is still legs in and your forward person is legs out. That's kind of a 7-knot position. The jib trimmer needs to be really ready to swing their legs out to meet any small change in pressure so that the boat doesn't wind up and stall, but so it can keep going straight on its lines anytime the pressure hits it.
Yeah. So, and this is, it's really interesting because we add one knot to this whole discussion that we're having, and all of a sudden we're fully hiked and we're starting to pull controls on to essentially change the mode, but also it's really comes down to just release some of the drag that's in the boat that we have from these sort of very powered up settings to allow the boat to achieve a higher boat speed through the water. And it's really going from the flaps down setting that you would think about, where you're looking for power to get people hiking, to all of a sudden you add 2 knots to this forecast, and and you're at the top end of it, the 10-knot range, the 9-knot range, depending upon which boat you're in. You're suddenly pulling controls on and that kind of stuff. So, Allan, talking about the Melges 24, and we can bring it back to the 70, but what are some of these controls? We all know backstay, we know, up on the rig and that kind of stuff. What are the controls that people tend to forget in these boats that are really powerful to get the boat powered up and then change the mode later on?
I mean, honestly, Mike, my biggest takeaway from the 24 was the jib sheet, and I think my honestly, the biggest thing was not trimming hard enough. And I think that was kind of my biggest takeaway. Is I think it's pretty easy to actually undersheet the jib on the boat and not get what you're looking for. So I think that's one of the things that, I'd go back to for a lot of folks, is just looking at your jib sheet, tensions, and, do some testing, especially in early lineups. I mean, you can sheet on pretty hard before that telltale will stop flowing, and kind of finding where that mode is. I know for me, for the first probably day or so of training, I just wasn't sheeting the jib hard enough, and it's kind of counterintuitive because you look at the foot and it looks kind of flat, and you're trying to ease, and maybe you got to make some lead adjustments. But I think the biggest thing is you got to sheet the jib pretty darn hard to make it kind of get the boat to where it wants to go and balance the boat out, so that way, quite honestly, so that way the driver can sheet the main on enough to balance out the jib, and then you can hike, right? It kind of is, it's kind of the big circle there, and it actually starts with the jib trim, I think. If the jib's not trimmed enough, like if you don't get out of your acceleration into kind of speed gear quick enough, you kind of just wallow in this half hiking, not really going. You need to sheet the jib on to be able to sheet the main on to hike. It's kind of a circle there.
Yeah, and almost exactly the opposite is true at times when it gets light or you hit bad
But
waves,
yeah,
where you can
yeah,
have the jib sheet too sheeted and then you have to ease it. And that's where, and I know
yeah,
I'm sure it's critical in the 72 where you're
yeah.
just, yeah. So,
Yeah,
so talk to that.
I think even more than the 70, like my takeaway from the 24 was in that light, sub 10 range, even up to 10, how critical adjusting the jib is for, puff comes on, you got a sheet on, and as soon as the puff goes away, you got to get the jib out. And we're talking small adjustments, but you're talking about controls. It seems like the jib sheet is the control. Don't tell the drivers or the main sheet trimmers that, but it seems like a pretty big control that kind of dictates everything else on the boat. So, um, yeah, it was a good learning point because I think, if you're talking about J70, it's almost kind of the similar adjustment of the in-hauler, situation. It's like in that range, you got to be adjusting something all the time. And on the 70, it's the in-hauler, and I think on the 24, it's the leeward sheet. So it's a lot of moving. And I think the other thing for me that I've learned is the jib lead is adjusted quite a bit, determining, you may even be asymmetrical depending upon the wave action from tack to tack and that type of stuff too. So
Yeah, and what you really said at the end there was interesting because again, the jib sheet holds true in the 70 as well, but you have that in haul and you have that interesting, that other side of it. So, you
yeah.
know, um, either, Stu, Dave, or Nick, one of you guys want to take on the 70, just the jib in haul and how you're playing that through that range as well, similar to the 24.
Yeah, happy to take that one, Mike. So last 2 years, I did quite a bit of jib trimming. Had the pleasure of sitting with Alan and Kate on the casting couch, and my primary spot was upwind, downwind trim. And like I said earlier, developing a process, having good marks, and consistent settings is key. So when you're making these adjustments, you know how much you're doing it and what it's actually changing. On the J70, the windward sheet does quite a bit to the jib setup. And if the boat feels stuck or sticky, easing a millimeter or two of windward sheet can open things up, rebalance the boat a little bit, and kind of help the boat accelerate some. Once the boat gets into that, okay, I want to go into that fifth gear and sail higher, then you can pull that windward sheet back on. Uh, but it's also, you can get stuck in a scenario where you're adjusting it too much. And we found that setup where it found this, it made this mistake really is in the puffs and the lulls were in hauler on, in hauler off. And it was hard for the driver, Kate in this instance, to kind of find a good groove. So yes, you do want to be dynamic, puffs and lulls, but you can get to a point where you can overdo it. And I don't want you guys to have that issue where we're making these adjustments, but overdoing it, and then the boat's performance is going to suffer from that.
Yeah, and I think almost in the Melges 24, it's almost near the opposite, where you have to be moving it so often, especially in that range, and it's really, really important. And so then we go the other side of this range and we take away, we now have the boat all the way powered up. We're trying to get people hiking. We take away a knot out of that wind speed and we end up in Biscayne Bay, a potential, inside course. And one of the questions that came from from the people who signed up, was just current in the bay. And I'm going to defer to the person who's potentially sailed the most hours in the bay, which is Stu. And probably Dave as well. But just I have the map of the bay here, and just give us, I want to kind of keep this to a half an hour. So we've got a couple of minutes here, and if anyone else has anything to add on it, just the idea on what you're seeing in terms of the direction of the current, what you're going to be seeing in terms of current speed going into the weekend. So let me see if I can get this up and shared. So, but feel free to go
Yeah,
ahead
sure.
and start.
The most important thing is just to understand that outgoing tides, the current goes towards the bridges. And so it's kind of a flow to the north northeast. And an incoming tide the current flows from the bridges into the bay. Um, you do get, you can get a jet of current that comes around the tip of Key Biscayne through the channel around the south tip there. Um, and you also get current going over Stiltsville, and you can see those little channels there, but that's very shallow water, so you're not getting a large volume of water pushing there. If the course is set such that it's close to Stiltsville, you can get that slide of sideways current coming in before it meets the larger flow on the bay. Also, sometimes the courses are set, this is perhaps more in the easterly breezes where the windward mark is close to that kind of southwestern tip of Key Biscayne, where the two shoots of current actually meet. And so the right side of the current of the course can get slightly different current effects than the left side of the course. However, for what we're looking at for this weekend, I'm seeing a very weak high hanging to our east. And so we're more or less going to get easterly breezes eventually going around to south. It's going to be a light gradient. So we'll have plenty of thermal effect in there. And granted, thermal effect really isn't that strong on Biscayne Bay. So ends up being fairly weak sea breezes. But what happens as the breeze rotates around to the southeast, you can get a very strong cross course current, and you particularly feel it in the races which are under 8 knots. And so you need to be aware what the current is doing on that day. It's very easy to get pulled outside of the ley lines on the downwind or the upwind.
And for either Dave or Alan, what are you guys using at the beginning of the day to kind of, besides obviously looking at the current charts, what are you using at the beginning of the day to sort of check that current in your upwind morning tune-ups?
I can take that. One of the primary things I like to look at is just what the coefficient of the current is, effectively how strong the current is going to be. And that kind of gives me a little bit of a bookend as to uh, whether it's going to be something that's truly a course play, or is it just something that's going to affect the very tops of my ley lines and bottoms. In terms of what I like to do prior to the start is just simply get enough maneuvers near a stationary object, i.e. a buoy, that I can see what's happening there, and then have that discussion in your mind as you're sailing up the course. And granted, maybe only have time to do a 75% practice beat, but have that discussion in your mind of just if you are observing current, and believe it or not, you can feel it in your butt. Alan, what are your
Yeah, and
thoughts?
yeah,
Me?
Go on.
Oh, sorry.
yeah, Alan.
I mean, for me, I trust the current charts that you can get, online. I think they're pretty darn accurate, depending on where you get them. I think the old sponge, floating around and doing your own checks also doesn't hurt. I mean, I think for me in Biscayne Bay, I think sometimes the current gets a little bit overblown. I think you want a general idea of which way it's going, but I think, on these light easterly, and Dave, you can comment on this. So, the bigger factors there are, finding pressure, where the cloud lines are, whether you need to be under clouds or outside of being under clouds, and kind of those type of things tend to have a bigger effect, especially if you get further away, like into the more open part of the bay, I'd say, like towards the tip of Key Biscayne. Whereas, if you're up in the upper bay there, it's just shifty, it's kind of jungle ball. It's a bit of a different scenario, like the last event. But if you're further down the bay, I think it's obviously you want to know for ley lines and other things the current trends, but the lighter the air there, I think pressure lines and knowing where to be is for me a bigger piece of the puzzle than current per se. I mean, you want to know it, obviously. I don't think, I think both of everyone on this call would agree. It's pretty hard to count the number of times that a team that went down current gained on a beat on Biscayne Bay, generally speaking. But, the pressure is always kind of the king, it seems like, in this lighter stuff.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, I've done a lot of sailing with Stu, and we used to say on those type of days it would be, this is a wind over current type of day, and
Yeah.
it's just a way of reminding yourself that playing the breeze features is obviously the top priority. And for me, just this entire discussion over the last half hour, the big takeaway on a light easterly or light southeasterly is being able to sail your boat through the transitions and have a consistent angle of heel. And as you said earlier, just setting up your boat so that you can trim properly against it. For me, that's the most important. And the second most important would be identifying the cloud features on the course. And there's going to be less wind under the clouds and more wind outside of those, and that for me trumps the current play itself. Now, the flip side is if the course is placed in a particular area, then like we had the Melges 24s at the last Bacardi series, we were tucked closer to Bear Cut and the channel there. Then you're going to have that discussion be a bit more current dependent there.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and it really comes down very much to race course placement and the general trends from the current. So we did set ourselves a time frame of half an hour, and we want to respect everyone's time on this. So I want to thank the group on here for coming on, and I think Dave, you really nailed it well at the end there, which is the statement of this weekend. If the forecast is what we think it is, it's going to be very much in that transition range. It's going to be, deciding the general trends of where the pressure is, the clouds, that kind of stuff, but also really pushing the boats hard in the transitions and how you get people out hiking, or how then you release the boat when you do have everyone hiking to really get, the boat going forward and racing as fast as it can up the course. So, I think if we all think about that as a race course, and that's a pretty good summary of all the stuff that we've talked about here. So big thanks to everyone who came on, and I think we'll call it a day there.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Mike.
Dave.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.